Okay, in this next assignment, we are going to learn how to make a cup using a plaster mold. We're going to center a piece of clay on the wheel, trim it, and then I'm going to show you how to make a plaster mold. Most of you have used a plaster mold before, but you've never actually made your own. So let's get started. So just like you did before, you're going to center a piece of clay on the wheel, bring it up into a cone, wedge it back down, and then get it so it looks like the right proportion of a cup, or something that would fit nicely in your hand. You don't want it to be too wide and tapered, or it's going to look like a bowl. And you don't want it to be too tall and skinny, or it will look like a vase. So something that looks like the right proportions of a cup. Once you've smoothed the cup, you're going to make sure that you put a little notch in the bottom using a stick. That little notch is going to make a groove that your wire is going to go into. Make sure that the edge of your pot is completely smoothed. You can put a slight bevel in the foot. Make sure that the top is completely flat and that there are no undercuts. Now I've cut my clay cup, which is actually not a cup, it's a solid piece of clay right now, off the wheel. I'm going to blast it with the heat gun for a few minutes so it's firm enough for me to pick up with my hand, and then I'm going to transfer it into this clean bucket where I'm going to pour plaster over the cup and let it harden. Once that has hardened, we'll take it out and it will be our one-piece cup mold. Notice that the bottom of our bucket has some indentations in it. And we want our cup to sit up flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour a little tiny bit of slip in the bottom of this cup so that it makes a nice level flat surface before I put the cup in. Okay, so I have my bucket here. I poured just a little tiny bit of slip just to even out the bottom of the bucket and just enough to cover the bottom of the cup so that it's a nice and flat seal between the cup and the slip. Once that slip dries and is firm to the touch, then we can start mixing our plaster and we will fill the bucket up with plaster right above the top of our cup, depending on how tall our cup is. Okay. After your cup has dried on its slab or in a little tiny bit of slip, you're going to make the plaster. You're going to need 3 small buckets for measuring and 1 large bucket for mixing. The ratio for mixing the plaster is 1 part water to 2 parts plaster. It's best to have 3 cups and have it all the way measured out before you start. So, take your big bucket. You're going to measure water up to the rim of this cup. It's approximately 28 ounces. You're going to pour that into your mixing bucket. And then you have your 2 parts of plaster, and you're slowly just going to put it into the bucket and let the water slake into the plaster. Once you start getting enough plaster in there, it's going to start forming an island. And once that island stays permanently, you know the ratio is about right. They call it the island mixing method. Just let it slowly dissolve. Now that the plaster is all mixed up, I'm slowly pouring it over the inverted cup into the other bucket. Slowly pouring it so that it covers the cup and then about an inch or two. If you have extra plaster left over, you can just pour it into one of these little cups, and this will make a really good hump mold later. Okay, and then we just let this dry for about 20 minutes. We're going to give it a couple taps on the table to get the air bubbles out, and it will set up in about 20 minutes. Okay, now that the plaster is set up, we have our first plaster mold. It's a one-piece mold. So now, all I have to do is let this dry for a little bit, and I have a plaster mold. We will pour a slip into here, time it for about 10 or 15 minutes, depending on how thick you want your cup, and then we will pour the excess back into the slip jug, let it dry, invert it, and then once it dries, it will shrink a little bit and then it will fall out. So this is how you make a one-piece cup mold. Okay, I've just mixed my slip with the mixer, and now I'm going to pour it into my one-piece cup mold. I'm going to pour it in slowly until it gets all the way up to the top. And I'm just going to let it go over just a little tiny bit. And as this dries, it's actually going to suck into the mold. The plaster mold is going to suck out some of the moisture into the slip, and it's going to leave a thick coating on the inside of that. And that thick coating is going to be our cup. For this first one, for probably about 12 minutes. And then I'll gauge the thickness of it, and if I want it thicker, then I'll re-pour it and let it sit for maybe 15 minutes. And then you'll decide how thick you want your cup and the appropriate time that you let the slip sit in before pouring it out. Alright. Okay, now it's been sitting for about 12-15 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and pour the excess back into the slip container. Sometimes I like to swirl it around so that it comes off evenly, so that there's no drip on the inside. I'm going to go ahead and let it sit. Real quick, you can see about the thickness, about how thick the wall of the cup is. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and let it sit until it all drains out. And then once you see that there is no more draining out, I'm going to go ahead and transfer it to a board and let it sit for a few minutes before tipping it over.